Peter Sheppard Skærved at the Schubert Club Music Museum, St. Paul, Minnesota. This is the second of a series of podcasts for the museum supported by Knowledge Exchange Research England. A Violinist explores the archives. As a musician, what do I find inspiring? The most obvious answer is the music that I play. One of the most exciting things about performing is that music does not happen until it is made, and the making of music involves, at its most basic, composition, performance, and listening. Every musician finds the silent scores that we use all the time to be at once objects of veneration and utility. They are, in every sense, what the pianist Daniel Ben Pienaar calls our daily bread. We spend whole lifetimes trying to understand them, scrutinize their meaning, look to find purchase in them, so that we might reach for the beauty, the truths that they so often reveal and hide in equal measure. And we understand them as primers, as instruction books, roadmaps. They tell us what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. Quite occasionally, they tell us why. But we musicians always need to know more. We need to discover more. This is not because there's any inadequacy in the way that music is communicated to us on the page or in the score. Indeed, by comparison with play or movie scripts, the notation of music is far more integrated. It offers an amazing simultaneity of multiple practicalities, of pitches, rhythms, dynamics, tempos, counterpoints, texts, and much more. But we musicians are never satisfied. Perhaps this very abundance of materials, of information, leads us to want something more, to try to dig deeper. I often think that we are convinced that music is a huge conspiracy, that the more composers tell us in their scores, the more we become convinced that they must be hiding something else from us. But something of this something else, this something more, that many of us reach for, can also be found in the letters between musicians. They offer us a glimpse behind the curtain of the celestial workings. All of this makes the collections, the paper holdings of the Schubert Club Music Museum here in St. Paul, Minnesota, at once a treasure and an inspiring toolkit for performers like me. I would like to explore just a few of the musicians that reach out to me from this extraordinary collection for a variety of reasons. Let's begin with material associated with one of the great traveling violinists, the first international musician to play in St. Paul and Minneapolis, the Norwegian violinist Ole Bull. He stands only a few miles from where I'm recording this, or rather his sculpture by Jakob Fjeld does, resplendent in Loring Park, Minneapolis, since 1896. For travelling musicians like me, one of the most pressing questions is, what do I bring with me? Even coming on a relative short trip to the US like this autumn, I struggled to decide what performing materials I should take. Most of the weight of my 50-pound baggage allowance is music. This was ever the question. Especially the case for Ole Bull, who toured regularly in the USA from the 1840s and eventually made his American home down the road in Madison, Wisconsin, some years after the collapse of his Oleana colony in Potter County, Pennsylvania. The extraordinary portfolio in the collection here is a practical touring collection of his music, written in Bull's very recognizable musical script. It was prepared for some of the keyboard players who provided accompaniments for him. Pianists, of course, such as Maurice Strakosch, the uncle of the young singer Adelina Patti, who played for Bull on his first appearance not far from here in 1856. But also it was prepared for harmonium players. What's fascinating about some of the old houses up on the hill behind us here in St. Paul is that so many of them were furnished, when they were built in the late 19th century, with all the keyboards necessary for well-appointed houses. Increasingly large square pianos, of course, but, wherever possible, harmoniums, small organs. Latterly, these came to be used for hymn singing at home, but they were often played alongside the piano as a duo, as a chamber stand-in for the missing orchestra, which is what is going on with the materials collected in this book. For one of the sheets is a harmonium part to be played with the piano of the tune Et Cetibus, engraved on the side of Fjeld's statue in the park over the river in Minneapolis. On the back page of Bull's portfolio, there's a typical joke in his handwriting. Perhaps it's a wry allusion to his incessant travelling. It reads, Ole Bull, född I Bangalore. Ole Bull, born in Bangalore. Bull, of course, made his way all the way to Egypt, and as far as Grass Valley, California, now Nevada, to Cuba. But he never visited India. He wasn't born in Bangalore, he was born in Bergen. It's not a very good joke, but I imagine it amused him. Travel was a source of great anxiety for touring artists in the 19th century, and even with the advent of steam, it did not necessarily become any safer. The first timetabled steamship service across the Atlantic was introduced in 1843. For all that, Ole Bull was never able to persuade his dear friend Hans Christian Andersen to take the ship to America, where an enormous public would have awaited him. Andersen's determination not to venture an Atlantic crossing was rendered final in 1858 when his dear friend Henrietta Wolff died en route to America in the wreck of the steamboat SS Austria. Bull's first trips to the USA had been on sailing ships, but as with the innovations in road and rail travel in the 1830s and 40s, new technologies did not ensure more safety at sea. Charles Dickens, of course, was involved in a horrific train crash, and Bull escaped not one, but 2 steamboat fires in the USA. In the collection here, there is a letter from the great pianist-composer Clara Schumann, also a friend of Ole Bull. It brings these concerns home. Baden, the 11th of July, 1873. Dearest Father, thank heaven you are on the road to recovery. Today we received horrible news, and I am completely shaken. My brother, Voldemar, with wife and child, wanted to go to Thuringen. At the first station in Rotterdam, a train hit theirs. His wife was thrown from the railway carriage. As she fell, she dropped her child, just 2 years old, from her arms. He slipped between the wheels, and his leg was so badly crushed that it had to be amputated immediately. He's alive, but one really cannot wish for him to survive. How terrible the train accidents are now. With my sincerest greetings, your Clara. I can't see her handwriting without feeling the extraordinary sensitive lyricism of her compositions, such as her Opus 21 romances. The Voldemar in that heartbreaking letter was the composer-pianist Voldemar Bargiel, Clara's half-brother. Clara's great friend and collaborator, composer Johannes Brahms, did not enjoy travelling. For decades he resisted the entreaties of their mutual friend, Hungarian composer, violinist Josef Joachim, to tour with him, as a letter in the collection here makes clear. Every day I can expect Joachim to take me to Transylvania. For that, however, I need the above holy scriptures, Beethoven, Schubert, and Schumann to preach to the heathens. Brahms never went to the Balkans and was equally resistant to England, while Joachim played nearly every year from 1844 to 1904. Brahms was scathing about the huge British amateur choirs. The very idea made him shudder. And he turned down at least 6 separate invitations to come, from potential festival commissions to performance opportunities, and 2 attempts to coax him to a Cambridge University to receive an honorary doctorate. He could never be persuaded. Many of the letters speak about collaboration, and there was no greater nor grumpier collaborator than Johannes Brahms. His performing career had begun as accompanist to another travelling Hungarian violinist, Edi Remenyi, who later died on stage in San Francisco. Then, of course, he worked with both the Schumanns and proceeded to produce an astonishing body of work with and for Joseph Joachim. What is fascinating about this letter is it shows the preparation for their work together. It's the content of the main body of the letter. Dear friend, I have an urgent request. So urgent that it is not even enough to do it immediately. You must have already done it. For the next 14 days, I definitely need 2 violin sonatas by Beethoven, 1 in G major and 1 in C minor, and the Kreutzer Sonata. Then the Rondo for violin and orchestra by Schubert, and lastly the F minor Sonata Octo by Schumann. The latter may be later on, or not at all if you don't find it. In case you cannot access these things in the archive, it will also be alright if you buy the Peters Verlag issue, and if the sonatas there are not available individually, the complete sonatas from Beethoven for violin, the same with Schubert. But these things should be in the mail right now. Here's a sliver of music that Joachim left in a visitor's book, an album in Göttingen. In the same year that Brahms wrote his letter, Joseph Joachim met a 20-year-old Belgian concertmaster of the Benjamin Bilse Brauhaus Orchestra. This later became the Berlin Philharmonic. He encouraged the young man to think beyond a career as an orchestral leader to be a soloist. And soon, the brilliant young violinist was collaborating with Joachim's duo pianist, Clara Schumann, playing sonatas. This was the Belgian violinist Eugène Ysaÿe. Like all the performers that we're talking about today, Ysaÿe was a performer-composer. Ysaÿe, like all musicians, could never really say why things went right or wrong on stage. And they, and we, and he never stopped worrying about it. Perhaps the problem that this greatest of early 20th century Belgian violinists faced was of being fundamentally a natural player. When the teenage Ysaÿe had played his prize-winning diploma recital in Liège, the great virtuoso Henri Vieuxtemps, who was chairing the panel, noted on the margin of his mark sheet, "Ysaÿe plays the violin as the birds sing, naturally." Interestingly, the problems Ysaÿe later faced mirrored many of the problems that his greatest one-time student, Yehudi Menuhin, endured for much of his career. The challenge of tremendous natural ability unsupported by matching technical preparation. This was in some degree due to the strange methods of his first teacher in San Francisco, Louis Persinger. Ysaÿe, like Menuhin, was indeed the most natural of violinists, and he also always suffered terribly with performance nerves. Once, after performing Elgar's violin concerto, not long after its 1910 premiere by Fritz Kreisler, he spotted the young fellow violinist Carl Flesch and whispered to him, "Oh, if only I had the tranquility of your bowing arm." A letter in the collection here documents the struggles that eventually would drive Ysaÿe from performing in the late 1920s, exacerbated by his diabetes. It was written from Lodz in January 1925 to his American second wife, Jeanette Dinsin, who was 44 years younger than he. "Yesterday evening here was not good. I played badly, without creating, as if indifferent, with mediocre physical, technical means and a capricious and unstable bow arm. Having 1.5 days of rest, I hope to find myself back to normal tomorrow in Krakow. As a violin player, I sympathize and empathize with his plight. The instrument is a capricious collaborator, a situation exacerbated by the physical complexity of making it work at all. Any physical incapacity from the player is instantly revealed to all and sundry by the merciless amplification of its technique. This is why we practice incessantly and are still surprised, unpleasantly and sometimes pleasantly, by public outcomes. Let's circle back to Joachim and his descendants, to long after the meeting with Isai in Bonn. Joachim would have 2 great nieces who were also spectacularly gifted violinists themselves, Yeli and Adila Darani. Adila took the married name Faciri. Yeli never married. She never recovered from the death of her lover, the Australian composer Osmond Septimus Kelly, at Gallipoli in 1916. Today, Yeli is the more remembered. She inspired and collaborated with many composers and premiered Bartók's 2 sonatas with the composer at the keyboard, as well as works by Vaughan Williams and Ravel. His celebrated Tzigane is very much a portrait of her performance style. Adila and Yeli were dedicatees of Gustav Holst's double concerto. They both made homes in the United Kingdom from the mid-1920s onwards. And it seems that Adila's incandescent violin playing was also inspiration for Leos Janáček's unfinished violin concerto, which found its way into the materials of his Diary of One Who Disappeared. Before the First World War, the young Béla Bartók had been the sister's piano tutor in Budapest, and they all remained in touch until his death in the USA at the end of World War II. An undated letter in the collection here speaks of the onset of the illness which would eventually kill Bartók and the irritations of concert life. Interestingly, the listening from backstage, which he speaks of, or from the wings, has largely vanished from the classical world, though not elsewhere, where the backstage pass is still highly prized currency. Clearly, the problems Bartók faced, referred to in this letter, were much to do with the fact that he did not have the right lanyard. Dear Adila, I wanted to be the first to congratulate you on your success tonight. It is an outrage that the doorman of the artist's room was not even willing to announce anyone. He said you have to have permission for X or Y to enter. The only thing to do was to turn around on my heel and leave, and I would so much like to have heard the first selection from the artist's room because of my frightful fatigue, and then take my leave. I could not have taken a seat in the concert hall, but such a Cerberus was standing in front of your door. Bartók. To round off this little talk, I would like to return to Ola Bull. Ola Bull first came to the Twin Cities, as I mentioned earlier, in the summer of 1856, on tour with the child prodigy soprano Adelina Patti, who was only 13 at the time. St. Paul was at that point not much more than a cluster of houses around the steamboat landing, and today it's possible to get a sense of the old city, the one that Bull would have found, if you nose around nearby Irvine Park, which is today separated from the Mississippi by the railroad and Sheppard Street. A charming record of Bull and Patti's pioneering visit in 1856 was left by the Swedish pianist and organist, one C.A. Widstrand, who together with the other professional musician in the Twin Cities, the violinist B.E. Messer, had founded a quintet club to give music salons. Widstrand supplied and tuned pianos. He wrote down his memories 40 years later, which explains a few of the anachronisms that crept in. Asking about Ola Bull in the Midwest today, where he remains as important a figure, a hero even, frequently results in misalignment of dates and people, often occasioned by how easy it is to forget how small the European settlements in and across the plains and prairies were until long after the Civil War ended in 1865. Widstrand recalled that the first of Bull's concerts on the east side of the river, that is St. Paul, was given in Edwards Hall. This is as unreliable a memoir as many of the stories told about Bull's performing venues today. Edwards Hall was, or would be, one of the student residences that formed part of Macalester College when it opened. It would have been exactly the kind of place where, there not being concert halls or theatres for some decades, Bull might have performed in 1856. But Macalester College was not founded until 1874. For all this, Widstrand left us a wonderful description of what used to be called getting up a concert, describing his part in the event that happened, quote, over on this side of the Mississippi. Widstrand was the first organist of the Gethsemane Church in Minneapolis. He noted that the concert took place, quote, in the upper story of Arthur McGee's grocery store on 2nd Avenue South, then called Helen Street, between Washington Avenue and 2nd Street. Widstrand continued, Mr. Bull came over on this side and inspected the very diminutive hall. He discovered what seemed to him a weakness in the floor, and insisted that extra timbers be put so as to make the hall perfectly safe before he consented to playing there. Bull himself was presenting and taking the risk for the concert. His touring journals that I've handled in Norway make this clear. He kept meticulous notes on the cost of getting venues ready for performance, down to numbering seats and stretching to buying the attendance of sympathetic local journalists. Naturally, he would also do what we might call today risk assessment for the venue. The audience falling through the floor of an upper floor concert room was not a risk he was willing to take. His journals for the spring of 1845, when he travelled from Montreal to New Orleans, are also marked out by the repeated costs to, quote, bear a piano, to carry the piano, which appear for the first time on his records for his first appearances in Nashville of that year. That one cost $2. Widstrand remembered that Bull was much incensed at what seemed to him to be an extortion when the parties owning the grand piano which had been used in the concert on the east side demanded $50 for taking the piano over to Minneapolis proper. His irritation is not surprising, bearing in mind that he was suddenly expected to stomach a 2,500% increase on what he paid for what he thought of as a trifling expense. Roughly adjusted for inflation, the amount that he was being asked for was about $1,800 in today's money. The approximate cost to deliver and tune a 9-foot Steinway in Minneapolis in 2022 is $2,200. Take away the $300 for a very good tuning at Steinway prices, and the cost is about the same. Bull would not be pleased today. But nonetheless, Bull finally succeeded, quote, as a makeshift in obtaining a small piano owned by Colonel Stevens. Colonel Stevens needed no introduction to Widstrand readers, as he was the first person given permission to build a house on the west bank of the Mississippi, over from Fort Snelling. Technically, he was the founder of Minneapolis. He properly enjoyed sticking it to the la-di-da types around today's Irving Park on the other side of the river. I have a feeling that the expensive piano was that in the Ramsey residence. We know that 20 years later, Mrs. Ramsey was happy to pay $1,500 for a new Steinway from Chicago. She was most likely the owner of the one quality instrument in the city. But wait a minute, quote, on the other side of the river. There was a bridge, a newish bridge, the first to cross the Mississippi, planned and built by Colonel Stevens. It had opened in 1855 to great fanfare, and then been promptly destroyed by a hurricane. The general opinion was that it was not safe. Just perhaps, Mrs. Ramsey had no wish to trust her precious instrument to the upstart West Bank Colonel's wobbly crossing. Widstrand continued. The piano, however, was badly out of tune, Widstrand recalled, and this fact afforded me the pleasure and privilege of tuning it for the great violinist, which seemed I did to his great and complete satisfaction, as he gave me a recommendation which I treasure to this day very highly. Widstrand's recollection of Bull's first appearance in the, quote, very diminutive hall above McGee's grocery stall is seen very much from his part in the success. Then Oda Bull came forward and struck the A on his violin. Mr. Roth struck the A on the piano, and off they went. Again, Widstrand's memory was playing tricks on him. At the piano was Patty's grown-up brother-in-law, the pianist Maurice Strakosch, who would tour with Bull many times in the following years. Mr. Bull afterwards expressed himself as much pleased with having the piano up to concert pitch, as in the West he had nearly always to lower his violins to suit the piano. Widstrand left a wonderful clue as to how small the Twin Cities actually were when Bull began his long association with the area. He remembered that, in the evening, the small hall was packed to its utmost capacity with the elite of the city. We were all elite at that time. Clearly everyone who was anyone was there, and everyone was there. According to Bull's notes of his 1845 tour, he would normally have ensured that there were advertisements paid for and press paid off, but according to Widstrand, there was no announcement in the papers of the concerts, but both had capacity crowds. Two newspapers already existed in the Twin Cities in 1856, and they're still there today, the Pioneer Press and the Star Tribune. They celebrated all of Bull's subsequent visits. It's lovely to recall this time when travelling musicians first found their way to Minneapolis and St. Paul, undaunted by the challenges which stopped Clara Schumann, Brahms, and even Joachim from travelling to the USA. We're celebrating the Schubert Club, founded just a few years after Mesmer and Widstrand's Quintet Club. If you come to Minneapolis today, you will find Bull and his friends difficult to avoid. In Loring Park, Jakob Fjeld's statue of Bull has stood playing in joyful third position since 1896. And in the same park, you can find the cottage where, without doubt, Bull went to try Colonel Stevens's little piano. This, the first house of the new city, was saved, and, also in 1896, re-erected as a memory of the early cities, which would celebrate Ole Bull to this day.